So I was tuning in to that show, the Rubin Report with Dave Rubin, and I saw that they had an episode with Michael Ian Black. It's one of those suggested videos on the side, and they were discussing things in a very low-key, low-energy manner, and a lot of people in the likes-dislikes ratio were not having it, and there were a lot of very negative comments. I mean, I guess Michael Ian Black is somewhat of a left-wing figure now. He had sort of a Twitter debate with Dana Lash from the NRA, so he can't be in too high of a standing with people on the right. But, Michael Ian Black, who is just a comedian, really, I guess he's a comedian turned political activist, like so many of them are, he dropped one sentence in their episode, in their discussion, when he said something to the effect of, to paraphrase, "You have to follow the law." Well, you don't have to follow the law. You just have to face the possibility of being arrested. And what he's actually talking about was, to give a more specific quote was, you shouldn't block the roads and the highways, with protests. But if someone were to do that, they have the ability to do that. They just have to face the possibility of being arrested. But, I wanted to sort of pull out the heart of what his statement was all about, because that just turns our legal system on its head. It's like, you have to follow the law, but wait, no you don't. You don't have to follow our laws. You just have to risk the possibility of being caught. And I'm not saying anything about morality or ethics, no. This is about legality. And there's a very famous line where it goes, "Laws are not fair, they are written." But it's like, even if we go beyond that, it's like, if people just don't get caught and they aren't held accountable, then where does that really leave us? First of all, that actually gives some credit to the libertarians when they sort of say that a law is just a fence in an open field, and it's just sort of like, hey, please don't climb over that fence. Well, Michael Ian Black, who is not coming from a libertarian perspective, kind of said something to that same effect. You have to follow the law. Unless you don't, then you just have to not get caught. But this is so much larger than the individual. This is so much larger than just, someone walking down the street and jaywalking or not waiting for the don't walk, walk sign to change. It's like, what about the mega banks? What about the industries that are so tremendously rich, like the arms industry or big oil? All they have to do is just find a way around the system, and then they can use their massive amounts of wealth to manipulate the system for their advantage. So it's like, and the economic historian Michael Hudson, who I was looking at today, gets really into a lot of that stuff when he's just sort of like, that is one of the things that kind of is a very destructive force in civilization, when it's like too much power gets concentrated into one particular industry, and then that just becomes the controlling force for all of society, because once they get so powerful, they don't have to follow the laws. They can use their power to manipulate around it, or at the very least, they can use their resources to find ways to avoid capture. More importantly, they can just bribe the politicians. And by bribery, we don't really need bribery in America. What we have is just things like super PACs. You don't have to declare where the money comes from. We have things like contributions, even if you do know where the money is coming from. Who's the largest contributor to the RNC? Elon Musk. It's like, these large concentrations of wealth do equal large concentrations of power. There's no doubt about it. And I don't think anyone is in dispute of that. But one of the things that we can look at is the stuff that Michael Hudson explores is that, he's coming at this from a very, very historical model when he sort of says a civilization needs to prosper by, even back to the oldest civilizations, they had the palace economies. Things prospered because, you had two roles for an individual. One was to be a soldier, and the other was to work on building a palace or building a temple. So it's like, well, who organized that stuff? It was just like, you could call it the king, the emperor. A sort of public sector did that. And the public sector had to be strong enough to give out these sort of tasks to all of the individuals. And that, of course, pushes us towards more of a male-female dynamic. Men are sort of working outside, women are sort of working more domestically. But we've evolved to the point where we're no longer dealing with only warfare and hard labor. So this also would incorporate women into the strong public sector economy. And that type of system that sort of founded the economic roots of civilization would not function if there were large mega banks that were just sucking up all of the money. And, you might be thinking, well, if they were to do anything illegal, then that has nothing to do with economics. That has nothing to do with the way that we go about, our daily lives. That's illegal. That should have absolutely no place in any sort of criticism of our contemporary era. They don't have the right to do that. But here's the thing, though. They're doing it anyway. They can use illegal measures to get around the laws, and they use their enormous wealth to their advantage. And you might see where someone like this is going with. The one exception that I would take with Michael Hudson is that, he is identifying himself as a Marxist, and you can't do that because Karl Marx is a fraud, absolutely. So it's just like there must be sort of another way to go about it. But when Michael Ian Black just makes that statement about how you don't have to follow the laws, you just have to sort of risk being arrested, you could look at it from any way. It's just like anyone could do this. The individual, a group of people, maybe crime families that, have a certain relationship. Maybe there's something about the mafia trying to assassinate JFK, or the Gambino family manipulating the governorship of Elliot Spitzer in New York. It's like they have ways of getting around the law. And this goes back to a lot of the things that the libertarians have been talking about, because they are more like, once again, good people don't need the laws, and bad people aren't going to follow the laws anyway. So it's like, you have that one sort of thing on one hand, and there's a very large other hand. It's just, if there only was some way to get rid of this large concentration of power that comes from the mega banks. Because it's like, in our current legal system, there is nothing wrong with just, a mega bank contributing to political campaigns. There's nothing wrong with a mega bank just going about their business. What's wrong is that they're doing illegal measures, and they don't have to have any accountability for it. We've also talked about, large gangs and things like the mafia. Those things are most definitely illegal, and they're just not getting caught. Not to mention, anybody who just breaks the law and doesn't get caught is a giant hole in the system. And it's an incentive for all of us not to follow the laws. Because if we do follow the laws, then we're missing out. And it's a rigged system. And that just turns into third world politics. That just turns into the third world, when everybody just starts breaking the law, and the police can't control them because everybody's doing it, so you can't put everyone in jail. So it just turns into this giant clusterfuck quagmire. What really is the answer, though? I mean, if you can't go the Marxist route, and, it's like, do you just sort of have no laws? But that doesn't eliminate the problem of having, too much power in the mega banks and big oil in the arms industries. One of the ways to do about this is to adopt the American system of political economy, where it's like, it's sort of more based on the traditional foundations of civilization that we laid out by Michael Hudson. It's advocated for by people like Lyndon LaRouche and, the Tax Wall Street Party, when they sort of say that it's just, first, you have to put in measures in place like Glass-Steagall. Then you need the National Bank. Then you need, to be exploring infrastructure projects that will unite all of humanity as a way of creating employment. And then space exploration. Those are the 4 economic laws of Lyndon LaRouche. When it comes to the Tax Wall Street Party, they're just like 1% Wall Street sales tax, nationalize the Federal Reserve, and then use the Federal Reserve to create a $5 trillion infrastructure plan to give us 30 million jobs. It's very, very similar. But they're just sort of like, you need some form of centralized power that is done on a national level as opposed to a private sector level, because the private sector has these forms of limitations that are only within themselves. Their limitation is only themselves. It's just whatever the mega banks feel like doing, because they're so powerful they cannot be controlled. But one way to change that is to just nationalize the Federal Reserve, and then you you put the Federal Reserve or the National Bank of the United States, whatever you would want to call it, that gets absorbed into the system of checks and balances. Because right now the mega banks have no checks and balances. Big oil has no checks and balances. The arms industry has no checks and balances. What is the military-industrial complex that everybody keeps talking about? All that is just a system. That is a consequence of our daily life. That is a consequence of the world in which we live in, where we just need Congress to have money in their coffers, and we need the flow of funds to the defense contractors. That's what the military-industrial complex is. It's not this giant calculated Alex Jones conspiracy. It's just sort of an after effect of the world that we live in. Now, you might be wondering about capitalism. One of the nice things about the American system of political economy is that it doesn't eliminate capitalism. Socialism is not an answer. Karl Marx was a buffoon. He was just a silly individual who probably just had a certain hatred for humanity and, expressed it very, very poorly in his writing. It's just like the way that we can go about this is, the American system of political economy is something that is older than Karl Marx. Alexander Hamilton was a champion of this back in the 1790s. It's just like, this would be a way where we could create employment for many individuals, and the National Bank can be sort of, the center point between creditors and create the creation of infrastructure projects. You're talking bridges, we're talking about tunnels. We are talking about even things like Franklin Roosevelt did during the Great Depression era, or coming out of the Great Depression, like planting trees, building new reservoirs. Projects that will benefit humanity can all be designed by the National Bank, or just nationalizing the Federal Reserve. You would keep some of the architecture of the current Federal Reserve, but you would cut the private bankers out of the equation. So many people are sitting around wondering, what problems do we solve with in the world? Well, I was just listening to Michael Ian Black on the Rubin Report, and I was like, he dropped one of the biggest bombshells, and he probably didn't even know it. He wasn't even aware of it when he made the statement that you don't have to follow the laws, you just have to pay the consequence of going to prison. Well, what if you didn't have to pay the consequence? What if you knew that there was a way around the system that you could break any law you wanted and you just wouldn't go to jail? Then you are outside of the legal system. And the way that happens is what we've talked about. It's about how people sort of concentrate wealth and power away from any sort of centralized public entity with a system of checks and balances and reserve it for a single industry that never has to change. It's no different than any third world dictatorship. All those white supremacists out there who think that they're superior to the third world. Everything is exactly the same. It's just we do it through the control mechanisms of the mega banks, big oil, the arms industries, what is generally accepted to be known as the deep state. And, we can also sort of say that there are things associated with the shadow government, but it's like, forget the conspiracy theory. This is not some bizarre calculated effort where all the people are sitting around a table masterminding all the worldly events. Yeah, that might happen a few times in human history, like Jekyll Island and the foundation of the Federal Reserve. Okay, you want to do something about it? Well, nationalize the Fed and cut the private bankers out of the equation. So many people think, what do we do in the world? How do we affect problems? How can I have any sort of impact on the world to try and make things better? Well, what you do is, you put pressure on the group that is ripping you off the most, and that is the mega banks. The second one is the arms industry. The third one is big oil. And the way you put pressure on them is, well, first you make them smaller through the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, and then you make them less powerful with something like a 1% Wall Street sales tax on derivatives. Absolutely. It's totally arguable whether or not you would want to tax things like stocks and bonds. Maybe 0.1% on bonds, but 1% tax on derivatives. Take away their power. Give it a chance.